second session, but our first panel session. And I'd like to now introduce and hand over to Karen Taliaferro, my colleague Karen Taliaferro. She's an assistant professor in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership here at Arizona State. She's a graduate of Marquette University and then a doctoral graduate in government from Georgetown University. Her research interests are in the history of political thought, religion and politics, and medieval Islamic philosophy. She's published a book, The Possibility of Religious Freedom, Early Natural Law and the Abrahamic Faiths, and we are very honored and glad to have her in SCETL. She will be chairing our panel on liberal arts and civic education, so I hand it to Karen.
Thank you so much, Will, and thank you all. We have quite an interesting panel this morning, Liberal Arts and Civic Education, Compatible or Conflicting, with guaranteed 3 excellent papers. First, we'll have Professor Daniel Mahoney, who is Professor Emeritus at Assumption University, where he taught political science from 1986 until 2021, holding the Augustin Chair in Distinguished Scholarship from 2011 to 2021 there. He's also now a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. We are delighted and honored to have him here with us at SCETL this semester. He's teaching, I believe, an undergraduate course with us. Professor Mahoney is the author or editor of 15 books, as well as a noted scholar on the thought of Raymond Aron, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Roger Scruton, and Pierre Menant. His latest book is The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, and that will be published by Encounter in the spring of 2025. He's also executive editor of Perspectives on Political Science, and his writings have been translated into 13 languages. Next up, we will have Professor Catherine Zuckert, who is the Nancy Reeves Jura Professor of Political Science Emerita at the University of Notre Dame. She's also currently leading a seminar here with us. We are also delighted and honored to have Professor Zuckert with us as a recurrent visiting professor. She's teaching a course on the search for self-knowledge in our graduate program. Her publications include almost too many books to list, but I'm going to anyway. Natural Right in the American Imagination, Political Philosophy in Novel Form, Postmodern Plato's, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Gadamer, Strauss, Derrida, Plato's Philosophers, The Coherence of the Dialogues, and finally Machiavelli's Politics, as well as 2 co-authored books with her husband, also with us, Michael Zuckert, The Truth About Leo Strauss, and Leo Strauss and the Problem of Political Philosophy. Dr. Zuckert has also written many articles on topics ranging from Alexis de Tocqueville's analysis of democracy in America to women in politics. And finally, we have Professor Jennifer Frey, who is the Dean of the Honors, the inaugural Dean of the Honors College at the University of Tulsa. She also has a secondary appointment there as Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and Religion. She was, prior to, I believe this year, she was an Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of South Carolina. Prior to that, she was, I believe she taught in the Humanities program at the University of Chicago, where she was also a junior fellow of the Society for Liberal Arts. Dr. Frey earned a multi-million-dollar grant from the John Templeton Foundation back in 2015, but I believe the fruits, we are all still experiencing the fruits today with a podcast, Sacred and Profane Love, I believe it is. The project itself was entitled Virtue, Happiness, and the Meaning of Life, so I suppose encompassing just about everything. She's published widely on 3 academic volumes on virtue and human action. Her writings have been featured in numerous publications, including First Things, Hedgehog Review, The Point, Wall Street Journal, and many others. Last and not remotely least, she lives with her husband and 6 children in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and then we'll begin with Professor Dan Mahoney.
Would you prefer us to go up there or to? Okay, fine. Well, thank you very much. It's a real delight to be here. I'm going to address the question of the relationship between liberal and civic education. I'm going to really address it, but in a somewhat indirect way. Let me begin by saying that I'll quote I think a very instructive remark of Leo Strauss's from 1944, an essay he wrote on the prospects for the political, spiritual, and intellectual reconstruction of Germany after they lost the war. And here's the question, what practical contribution could political philosophy make? In a way, Strauss says, well, not so much, you know, that practical life has a rhyme and rhythm of its own. But Strauss was also acutely aware, as the Second World War and the whole 30 Years' War of the 20th century had evidenced, that sound practice was assaulted by bad theory everywhere. And so Strauss concluded, in a very dialectical way, that one of the concrete contributions, maybe the principal concrete contribution that political philosophy could make to political practice was precisely defending political moderation, sound practice against ideology or bad theory. And I think that still holds. I think one of the problems is that the Anglo-American world, which rightly prided itself on its resistance to ideological politics, on the moderation and sobriety and common sense of our constitutionalism and our broader political life, I think most of us could say, circa 1960 or 70, that there was a marked, discernible difference, let's say, between the ideological currents that had come to dominate European politics with its large communist parties and its totalitarian movements, and the comparative sobriety of the United States. But to cite another major political thinker of the 20th century, Eric Voegelin, who was a refugee from Nazism, fled in 1938 before he was arrested by the Gestapo in Vienna. He wrote an essay in 1965 called "What is Political Reality?" And he ended the piece by talking about the remarkable resilience of the Anglo-American world against the ideological deformation of reality and politics. But he also said there's something strong and there's also something remarkably thin about the common sense that sort of undergirded and informed Anglo-American practice. On the one hand, the Anglo-American world was the world most resistant to what Voegelin very suggestively called modernity without restraint. On the other hand, he said, going back, let's say, to the Scottish common sense tradition, people like Thomas Reid and Sir William Hamilton, who were very influential in the sort of the backside of, let's say, the thinking of the American founding, this rich tradition of common sense, which Voegelin called a kind of truncated Aristotelianism without the philosophical apparatus. But Voegelin's point was that over time we had sort of forgotten what even the common sense tradition knew, the need for moral sense and civic moderation and the life of reason and rational debate to have rational articulation. And so his writing at the beginning of the New Left, where the very idea of rational debate was coming under assault, the sort of omnipresent ideology of the humanities today is based on a denial of a stable and enduring human nature, a complete denial of anything like the moral law, and I would say most problematically from the point of view of human decency and sound practice, an unwillingness to make any distinction between legitimate authority and authoritarianism. And in a way, some of this has its roots in early modern political philosophy. Hobbes, everything is power. The great longest chapter in Locke's essay on power. The whole human world is reduced to the emanations of power. The Romans had these distinctions, potestas, potentia, and all that. We don't. We see the human world as a world of power seeking, and it's very hard to have civic and decent and rational common life when, you might say, the underpinnings of common sense, of moderation, of shared human nature, are under systematic assault in the intellectual world. You know, the little write-up on our panel said, well, you know, liberal education tends to assault or to be more, you know, ambivalent or hostile toward civic life than it used to be. But I would say this isn't really liberal education. It's what the late Roger Scruton very suggestively called the culture of repudiation, or sometimes he called it the culture of negation. And what that meant was that a certain kind of the humanities, certainly literature, comparative literature, some of the social sciences, more and more historians and historiography, they see their job as upending civic gratitude, you know, assaulting our moral and civic inheritance. And, you know, I notice with my students that, not here though, not in my class this semester, but a lot of people use the word, a lot of students use the word deconstructing as a synonym for interpretation. You know, you hear it, the journalists, we're deconstructing this, we're deconstructing that. We're not deconstructing anything. We're trying to understand something, an understanding which is a principal task of liberal education is very different from these masters of suspicion who want to tear down and show that our civic inheritance, our moral inheritance, our philosophical inheritance is nothing but a justification for domination, exploitation, etc. So in this context, without ignoring the differences between philosophy proper, liberal education, whose orientation cannot be taken exclusively from the here and now, nor I think an authentic civic education's orientation be taken exclusively from the here and now, but I think in this battle, and I think it is a battle, against the forces of negation and repudiation, I think the party of liberal education is allied with the party of rational, as somebody said, a kind of self-critical patriotism imbued with a spirit of civic and intellectual gratitude. Bertrand de Jouvenel, a great 20th century political philosopher, French political philosopher, is long forgotten, said, the wise man knows himself for debtor, you know, and I would say that spirit of gratitude as the first response of the human person is almost completely absent from higher education today, except perhaps at places like SCETL. So I think one thing we can do in the American context is those of us who are partisans of political philosophy, of liberal and civic, of the mating and meeting of liberal and civic education, is we can provide the resources for a cogent and compelling defense of liberty and human dignity. And in doing so, I think what we do is we make explicit the moral consensus that, let's say, the American founders could largely presuppose. I think our integralist friends who think, you know, the American founding is just a poison pill and it's, you know, America's just this epiphenomenalization of Hobbes and Locke and we're on the road to inexorable self-destruction and nihilism. At best, it's a terrible simplification, and at worst, it ignores the fact that the founders were hardly nihilists, and as I said before, they presupposed all sorts of goods and affirmations that they frankly didn't have to make explicit. But I will quote Marx's On the Jewish Question, not the exorable remarks about the Jewish people, but talking about liberalism, Marx says, the liberal order presupposes property, family, religion, but it does so in the form of rights to property, religion, etc. But Marx says, very wisely, I think, that presupposition is the weakest form of affirmation. In other words, if you presuppose something, as we have for an awful long time in Anglo-American civilization and or in a constitutional tradition, you are not really making explicit. You're not really passing on in a spirit of gratitude. Many of the things the founders, let's say, believed, but didn't feel the need to explicitly theorize. So it is true that the American political order, rooted in the achievement of the Founding Fathers, does give a priority to rights over duties, but they certainly never reduced, you might say, the tasks of a free and dignified human being and citizen to self-assertion or mere affirmation of rights at the expense of duty and obligation. They certainly understood the precious character of consent as the perhaps highest way of adjudicating political debates, but they never thought that the choice of the good was simply a matter of choice. In other words, they understood that there were larger ends and purposes that inform what we choose at both the political and extra-political level. I think they never understood the pursuit of happiness to be merely an idiosyncratic pursuit of happiness, a manifestation of self-will. In other words, they understood the pursuit of happiness as having some relationship to an objective understanding of virtue or happiness. The American founders in this view were not moral relativists, let alone moral nihilists. They rejected religious sectarianism and the forcible imposition of religious truth, but they nonetheless appealed to honor civic virtue and, in the words of Federalist 39, written by Madison, the honorable determination of a people to govern themselves. Honor is an important theme for the American framers. It's an important theme of the Declaration of Independence. You only read the first third of the Declaration, you'll have a very rights-oriented view of humanity and politics, and nature and nature's God. But look at all the theistic affirmations of providence and the supreme judge, and the appeals to magnanimity and honor, and of course the famous peroration appealing to sacrifice on behalf of our honorable determination to govern ourselves. So, long and short of it, I would suggest that one of the important tasks of, let's say, these burgeoning civic centers is not simply to return to the past, to the founding, let's say, as, in the sense of a historical moment, or to simply repeat and amplify the self-understanding of the founders, as important as is. But I would say we have to make more manifest and more clear the larger anthropology, the larger moral consensus that inform their achievement. I always say to my students, one key, I think it's very useful, by the way, you know, Tocqueville and Democracy in America has all those tripart comparisons of English liberty and America and the French. The French are general ideas and sort of fanatical modern political science gone to one extreme. But we didn't have a year zero, you know. We still had the Christian calendar, the year of our Lord. You know, 1787 wasn't year zero. 1776 wasn't year zero. Our dollar bill refers to the new order of the ages. There was a little bit of that sense that the language of Federalist I, we were doing something very new and important, showing that government by reflection and choice and not accident of force was possible. At the same time, there was no real animus against the classical and Christian embers that still informed our tradition. The vast majority of the founding generation remained religious believers and combined a belief in natural rights with a deference to the moral law, however grounded, or the notion of rights without duties, freedom without self-limitation was unthinkable for them. So I said that was the American consensus, and it's really a question of emphasis, I think. We have to emphasize certain aspects of our civilizational inheritance and our moral inheritance that are in danger of being forgotten. And I'm just told I have 1 minute left, so I will wrap up. We have a very efficient timekeeper here. I think that the one thing most needful, maybe that scholars and teachers grounded in the larger Western tradition, the great tradition of Western wisdom, is not to renounce legitimate self-criticism, not to, we have to be, I think in a Tocquevillian kind of way, friends but not flatterers of the modern democratic dispensation. But in the end, I think we're obliged to be defenders of politics, the dignity of the political vocation, which is almost forgotten today. We're obliged to be partisans of civilization, understood not in a relativistic way, the sheer multiplicity of civilization and cultures, but high civilization against those things that undermine both the life of rational inquiry and a freedom informed by moral and political responsibility. And I think most of all, we have to act as a counter to the spirit of negation. One of my favorite quotes these days is from a poem, W.H. Auden, published in 1925. "Come fix your eye upon me, I thirst for accusation." It seems to me we can do better than institutionalizing self-loathing as the centerpiece of education, and especially higher education. Thank you.
Okay, truth in advertising. I am a professor emerita of political science from the University of Notre Dame, but I have been asked to speak, as I understand it, as a member of the faculty of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, and it took me at least a year to learn to say that mouthful, and so it's easier to refer to SCETL. As such, I think that I am committed to the proposition that liberal education and civic education are not merely compatible. Each is, in fact, a necessary supplement for the other. Paul Carisse, the first director, wrote a mission statement in which he says, and I quote, "The mission of this school is to provide undergraduate and graduate students at this university with the foundation to succeed as lifelong learners and future leaders in political, economic, and social life. Our degrees and academic programs blend interdisciplinary study of the liberal arts and classic texts with examination of American ideas, institutions, and civic culture. Experiential learning in leadership and civic affairs, and the practice of civic discourse. SCETL also provides civic programming for the broader community and supports renewal of K through 12 civic education. That is a big, wide-ranging task, and it's proved difficult to fulfill it in a coherent program, but we've tried. Like the other members of this panel, I firmly believe that liberal education and civic education in a liberal democracy like the United States should go hand in hand. That does not mean, however, that there are not important differences and tensions between the two kinds of education. Indeed, I think it behooves us in trying to educate citizens and leaders of a democratic republic to recognize those differences and tensions between liberal and civic education, lest our effort to combine them fail as a result of our failure to recognize the difficulties involved. To determine whether liberal education and civic education are compatible, we have to begin by asking what a liberal education is. Turns out that question isn't quite as easy as you might think to answer. In the 30 years my husband and I spent teaching at one of the leading liberal arts colleges in the United States, we belonged to a small group of very stubborn faculty who kept trying to get our colleagues to raise and talk about that question. What is a liberal education? And we failed every single time. I think many of the faculty recognized they didn't have an answer to the question, or that if they offered one, there would be others who would vehemently disagree. So they settled for the now conventional distribution requirements, constituting a general education combined with a major in a recognized discipline in the humanities, social or natural sciences, mathematics, or the fine arts, as a description of liberal education offered at that college and many others. By way of contrast, I think the three members of this particular panel would agree that liberal education has traditionally been understood to mean an education suited to a free human being. In ancient Greece, where the idea first arose, a free human being was understood fundamentally not to be a slave. That means not to be ruled by another, much less owned. It seems obvious that such an education would be exactly the kind of education that citizens of a liberal democratic republic like the US should receive. But here's the rub. Those who are free to pursue the activities and way of life they choose, free from external restraints, especially the restraints imposed by the need to support themselves and their families, were in ancient Greece and continue in the United States today to be very few. A liberal education so defined, that is, an education that would enable individuals to investigate and seek to acquire what is truly good, beautiful, and just, is and continues to be a choice that can be made only by a few. Educating individuals in this manner would not appear to be suitable to an egalitarian democratic polity like the United States. As Alexis de Tocqueville shows in his classic study of democracy in America, Americans have always had the emphatically practical, pragmatic opinions that belong to a commercial public. And as current opinion polls show, both students and their parents think the first reason people should go to college is to get a good job. And the second reason is to learn what kind of job they would like to have. Fortunately, in modern times, the meaning of a liberal education has changed. As a result of the Reformation, Enlightenment, and Industrial Revolution, people no longer think education is or ought to be reserved for the wealthy few. We think all citizens of a modern liberal democracy need to acquire the information and skills required to analyze that information in order to determine whether the law, policy decisions, and execution of them by our popularly elected representatives is or is not in the public interest, and to replace those representatives and their appointees if their laws, policies, and enforcement don't serve the common good. Citizens of the United States thus need to learn about the complex institutions of our government, and I applaud Yuval Levin for reminding us of that, and of the way in which they work or fail to work in order to judge the people administering them and vote accordingly. That's where the need for civic education comes in, not merely or simply at the graduate level or the university level, but in grades K through 12. But those who teach at grades K through 12 must themselves learn how our complicated system of government and its laws work in order to instruct others. And that is the reason SCETL conducts workshops and designs its master's program primarily for teachers. When we ask more specifically, what exactly should be required for civic education, we come to another problem or set of problems. Unlike liberal education, civic education in K through 12, as well as some public state universities, is required. It is not a reflection or result of individual choice. It is state imposed. Most would agree that civic education must include basic knowledge of the institutions and operations of American government at all levels. But courses that merely present the facts concerning the institutions and their history do not arouse the interest or attention of students. And students in such required courses apparently haven't learned very much. A 2016 survey conducted by the Annenberg Public Policy Center found that only 26% of the Americans polled knew there were 3 branches of the federal government. And 18% had trust in this government about which they apparently know very little. It doesn't seem to be an exaggeration to conclude that civic education in the United States is in a state of crisis and that something needs to be done. But of course, what? Those most immediately responsible for responding to this crisis will necessarily be drawn from political and academic leaders who are college and university educated. And that's why SCETL concentrates on educating leaders. Because civic education in K through 12 is state-controlled, in a liberal democratic regime like ours, I think, it should be limited to the basics. Knowledge of our political institutions, their rationale and history, and some practical experience in organizing on a small scale, as for example, in school clubs for interested students. Creative teachers should be encouraged to find ways of involving students by proposing voluntary projects relating to current or past debates about public policy, but not require or demand them, partly to avoid accusations of partisan indoctrination, and partly to minimize resistance to requirements per se. As Benjamin and Jenna Story, who is here today, have detailed in their recently published proposal for university-level civic education, and I would recommend it to all of you, the information and analytic skills required for American citizens today to judge the actions or inactions of their government only begins with an understanding of the complex institutions and operations of our federal government. Voters today are asked to judge the adequacy of defense, foreign, economic, health, education, labor, transportation policies. Yet no one citizen, teacher, or elected representative can possibly acquire all the relevant information or evaluate all the alternatives, especially since the experts disagree. We citizens need to learn whom we can trust. We also need to learn how to express and deal with diversity of opinion, and so to resolve our differences, at least for the moment, by deliberating with others about what we as individuals and a community should do. This is the point at which civic education and liberal education both converge and diverge. Civic education is a requirement of a liberal democratic regime that we impose on children up through age 16. A truly liberal education, on the other hand, is essentially and necessarily a matter of choice. Fortunately, Americans have a wide range of choices if and when they seek a post-secondary education. The glory of American higher education for the past century, or century and a half, has been the variety of types of institutions, universities, public and private, liberal arts colleges, which are an American invention, national, international, regional or local, religious or secular, residential or urban, community colleges offering associate degrees and vocational training. But there is a kind of reason that citizens need to use in evaluating the character and performance of their representatives, that, as Aristotle observed long ago, and more recent neurological studies of the development of the human brain have shown, human beings cannot acquire until late adolescence or even into their early 20s. One needs to have a certain amount of experience dealing with other human beings, and learn to weigh different incommensurable goods or harms by engaging in deliberations with others who hold and articulate different opinions in order to acquire what is called practical reason or prudence. Some of this experience can be attained merely by taking a job and working. Temporary internships in various branches of government or industry clearly help young people decide what path to take and are therefore required of students who major in the program here. But many of the decisions voters are asked to make for the community require knowledge that extends beyond their own experience. In order to decide as a nation whether we should continue basically as we have in the past, voters need to know how and why we have proceeded in the past. That is the reason I began this talk with civic education. We can't judge whether what we are doing is the best thing possible or whether we should change our ways unless we know what we've been doing and why we've been doing it. But to determine whether our way is best, we then need to learn how other human beings face or have faced similar challenges and compare. We need to learn about other civilizations or cultures, other forms of government, other beliefs, other laws, and compare them with ours. At the same time, we have to try to discover the appropriate standards to use in judging what is good and bad, just and unjust, or useful and disadvantageous. These are largely now subjects of the disciplines called the humanities, history, literature, and philosophy, that have fallen somewhat into disrepute. As voters, we also confront challenges posed by the ongoing development of natural science and technology. Knowledge of the humanities alone will not tell us what to do, but knowledge of the STEM studies also won't tell us what to do. Most colleges and universities try to address this problem with general education requirements that force students to take a variety of kinds of courses and then specialize in a major. It is not possible for any individual to become an expert in all fields, but it is possible to learn what it takes to become an expert in one. And learning what expertise requires, as well as its limits, helps make everyone more conscious of his or her own limitations and more willing to consider the opinions and preferences of others. Lack of specialized knowledge is only one and not the most difficult of the important problems confronting voters, however. All questions of public policy, implicitly, if not explicitly, raise questions with which human beings have struggled for millennia. What is good? What is just? How free are or ought human beings to be? When are individuals justified in putting their own interests and beliefs before the community? When is the community justified in asking its citizens to sacrifice their lives? Do we have an obligation to respect the natural order? Or should we seek to transform it, including ourselves, to make nature more consistent with human desires? It is not clear that there is any one answer to these questions that is valid for all people, all times, and all places. But we do know that the answers to these questions have been long debated by some of the best minds, and that learning what can be said on the many sides of these questions helps people understand why they are difficult to answer and repeatedly raised. Like appreciation of what it requires to obtain specialized expertise and its limits, understanding how difficult it is to determine what is good, just, or merely advantageous, and to whom, makes responsible decision makers more moderate and patient. For these reasons, the curriculum of SCETL is organized around 4 topics: questions of justice and morality, and debates in American political history, political economy, and statesmanship or foreign policy. Students are asked not only to read and consider some of the answers given to these enduring questions in the past, but also to learn how to debate and deliberate about possible answers themselves in small seminar classes. To conclude, Liberal education is in some ways a highly desirable, if not absolutely necessary, extension of civic education in a liberal democracy. But it's not a form of education that is desired by or possible for all. That might be just as well, because there is an enduring tension between liberal education and civic education. Liberal education begins with the need to assess the adequacy of our own thoughts and opinions. Undertaken by the young, it necessarily leads them to question the opinions they have acquired from their parents and the community as a whole. The resulting conflict between the generations was the subject of a very funny comedy or set of comedies by Aristophanes in the 5th century Athens. But we see a similar generational divide today between sympathizers, respectively, of the Palestinians and Israel. This conflict is not necessarily insoluble or violent, but it is inevitable. I began by suggesting that it is not as easy as one might think to say what a liberal education is. I have argued that it consists primarily in the examination of our opinions in the company of others on the basis of reason in order to determine what is best. It may be easier to conclude simply by emphasizing what liberal education is not. It does not consist in the inculcation or indoctrination of young people with partisan political views or ideologies. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'm the only person on this panel who's not a political theorist, so bear with me. I'm a philosopher, which means that I just want to start by drawing a distinction that I think will be helpful, and that is a clear and sharp distinction between the liberal arts and what I would call the modern humanities. Contemporary practice of the humanities is not continuous with the traditional liberal arts, or I would argue kind of Renaissance studia humanitatis. Our contemporary humanities, for better or worse, in its self-conception and its practices, has its roots in the modern research university, as this was developed in 19th century Germany and then imported to the United States. As such, it is by and large now conceived and practiced in ways that I believe cut against liberal learning. For example, in our universities today, by and large, we no longer read literature in order to think about its meaning for our lives and how it might help us grow in virtue or self-knowledge. We read it through the lens of a variety of critical theories with an eye to producing scholarly works. The modern humanist has, by and large, become an expert, and therefore is not principally engaged in liberal learning with undergraduates. Liberal learning is not aimed at expertise, but at wisdom, which seeks to see how various disciplines and modes of inquiry form a unified and coherent whole. Moreover, of course, the liberal arts is much wider than the modern humanities. A liberal study is one that pursues wisdom for its own sake, rather than for the sake of some useful end. Its goal is a form of interior freedom, rather than some specific external end or work. It's important, I think, to keep this distinction in mind when we're thinking about reform in higher education, because to my mind, the difference is not so much about subject matter, but about pedagogical practices, methods, and goals. Unfortunately, the modern humanities is often not very humanistic in the traditional sense. So we cannot simply seek to revitalize the humanities if we are to solve our current problems. And of course, I say this as a modern humanist. Given this, I want to be clear that what I would like to defend is the liberal arts. The liberal arts, of course, are the arts that make a man free. Those are the arts that help us understand what it means to be a good human being and citizen. And therefore, I would say that liberal education is actually a kind of civil education, civic education. It's just a especially high form of it. A civic education is not merely about imparting knowledge that is relevant to understanding political reality and goods, the way that it might be in K through 12, although it is, of course, partly that. It is a kind of education that forms or shapes students so that they are capable of the duties and demands of citizenship. Meaningful democratic participation is a part of this, but a civic education is much broader and also includes an ability to understand and perceive how one can give back and strengthen one's communities, beginning with the community that is a classroom and a college. It's an essential part of a civic education that students understand the intellectual and cultural traditions that have profoundly shaped their own society. American students have a very clear and compelling reason to study the Western intellectual tradition. They live in the West. Even for those Americans from immigrant communities that are non-Western, have good reason to be educated in this tradition as well, for the simple reason that this tradition explains the society that they have immigrated to. One clear reason that a great books education has always been, I would argue, a kind of civic education is not because these books are the only great books or the best books, or because these books are part of the only tradition worthy of study, but simply because it invites students into the tradition that has in fact profoundly shaped their lives already in ways they do not even fully comprehend or see themselves. This study fosters the ability to forge connections between that great conversation of the past to their present lived reality. Such an education explicitly looks to the past to see how, in fact, it bears on the present, but most importantly, it helps students to deliberate better about their collective future. It's an education that recognizes the essential historicity of the human person, that we don't and never have merely lived in the present. The present is always suffused with the past, and it is aimed at a future that demands our collective deliberation, in the best case, in light of knowledge of the past. Are there tensions between the liberal arts and civic education? Let us tease out what a supposed tension is supposed to be. Here's one common line of thought. Students must be free to choose their own values and to make their own lives. They should be free, for example, to reject wisdom, civility, patience, diligence, fortitude, and the like as concepts of white supremacy, say, or in some other way oppressive, unnecessary, or frankly useless to them, given what they desire. Encouraging students to seek practical wisdom, to discern how they might contribute to the common good, and to focus on the cultivation of those good habits of mind and character necessary for good citizenship is to assume for them what ought to be up for debate in liberal learning, what the good is. Students must autonomously decide what the good is, not discover it through the study of some specific tradition. Scholars should cultivate a rigid form of neutrality about the good, and they should teach from a position of mere expertise and always avoid pontification about the meaning of life or human flourishing. To attempt anything like what the Greeks called paideia in higher education, right, a kind of deep formation of the person, is to confuse the professor with the prophet or the priest, and here I'm striving my best to sound like Weber. It seems to me that this line of thought, and that line of thought manifests itself in different ways, but still very much with us. It seems to me that this line of thought rests on a misunderstanding about the liberality of liberal education, the sense of freedom at its heart, right? The sense of freedom at the heart of the Weberian account is indifferent to the very real goods at stake in such an education. What is absent from it is the recognition that truth, goodness, and beauty are transcendent goods that are at the heart of human flourishing, no matter how you're going to parse that. It is part of our nature, or our shared humanity, that we do, in fact, want to know and understand the world, to possess what we believe is good, and to appreciate what we find beautiful. Liberal learning is a process that helps students discover for themselves what is true, good and beautiful, and to understand the reasons why, right? To have the logos, to possess a rational account of what they believe, how they are acting, what they love, and what they find beautiful. A truly liberal education will help them reflect deeply and in a sustained way on the ultimate questions of human life, questions that do in fact bear on who they are, what they will do with their talents and time, and what they will appreciate. A liberal education does not tell students what the correct answers are, what the correct logos is, but it does ask them to consider, in a deep and sustained way, what our inherited tradition has offered as answers and methods. It does presume that Aristotle, Plato, Augustine, Aquinas, and Pascal, for example, are good conversation partners, and that we have much to learn from engaging them. Well, it's true that in the end, students, of course, as human beings, must fashion for themselves a vision of the good. But I disagree that they don't need any guidance in this endeavor, or that any old curriculum will help them to accomplish this, or that a rigid neutrality that denies, right, that there are real goods that we're trying to pursue in education is necessary. Another aspect of the liberality of liberal education that bears emphasis is that freedom, right? Freedom isn't free. Freedom only comes through the cultivation of those habits of mind and character that make human freedom so much as possible. We are not free when we are ignorant. We are most free when we have become wise, or at least gotten closer to that endless task. Wisdom is something that we have to actively seek together, right? When we study those texts that set us down the path of liberal learning by, again, asking these questions that are at the heart of human life. But we ask them in a community of learners who seek the same common goal, right? The same common end of wisdom or universal knowledge, right? And this process of liberal learning that is taking place in the classroom is a process of a kind of dialectical exchange, close study of texts. It's a very demanding, active sort of learning. And it does, of course, involve the habituation into good habits of thinking and reading and studying. But much more than that, and I would really press on this, is that it does also involve the cultivation of good habits of character. If you are going to really enter into meaningful dialectical exchange with another human being, you do actually have to be patient. You do actually have to have a modicum of humility. You do have to be willing to listen to the perspective of people who do not share, for example, your first principles or premises. You cannot be the kind of person who seeks to dominate or control the conversation, a person for whom study is really more of an expression of the kind of will to power or will to dominate other people, who sees the classroom as a space of just competition and ambition, right? I mean, we all know that student who is kind of unteachable because they will not recognize that they have anything to learn. They have it figured out. That kind of student is nearly impossible to educate liberally. And so I really want to press this idea that it is a kind of formation. There are really specific habits of mind and character that we need for it to be successful, especially, again, in a community, right? I think one of the things that gets lost when we talk about education, and a lot of this just has to do with how our universities are structured and the way that our seminars run, we've lost the idea that we are actually a community of learners in that space seeking a common good. And any time that you are seeking a common good, you have to have those habits that allow you to seek a common good together. Okay, so I know that we're running a little bit over, so I will skip some pages here and wrap up and just say that to practice liberal learning is to become at least partially equipped with those habits of mind and character that allow students to construct a vision of a good life. It's an education in freedom because that vision, right, will determine their life choices. They'll keep coming back to that vision. It will determine, right, what they choose in life. Part of our job is to make sure that our students are able to understand themselves as parts or participants in the greater whole that is civil society, and to understand how in our education we are helping them fulfill their duties and obligations to it, as well as helping them to think creatively about how they can positively contribute back to the flourishing, not just of themselves, but to this greater whole. Thank you.
All right, thank you to all three speakers. I'll just ask, I think, one question perhaps to the panel, since we're a little bit low on time, and then we'll move to an audience Q&A. So by all means, please prepare your questions. So it seems to me that on the one hand, civic education requires liberal education. I think that I'm hearing this in all three of the talks. One needs to be prepared to be free in order to be a good citizen. On the other hand, and now I think what Professor Frey has just mentioned, we do all know those students that are unteachable in a liberal way. So in the sense that they are not interested in, I'm trying to characterize this in Professor Zuckert's words, examining our opinions with others using reason to determine what is best. That's, for one thing, it's a mature task. It's not easy. And for another thing, it requires pre-existing traits that not all students have. Humility among them, inquisitiveness. So I suppose my question that this is leading to is, can civic education, and mind, as a member of the faculty at SCETL, I'm also deeply committed to the proposition that they both are compatible and in fact require each other. Nevertheless, can civic education serve as an adequate liberal education in the sense of providing what someone needs to be free for those who are not interested in a liberal education? Or alternatively, must they be forced to be free, to badly abuse that abusive phrase? Must they be forced to be free by being exposed to a liberal education, even if they don't yet recognize a need for it? I hope that makes sense as a question. Any order you choose.
You know, I always think there's a danger in approaching civic education in a too autarkic way. You know, I have friends and colleagues who think, you know, the American regime has to be at the center of everything, and that means, you know, civic education and liberal education are primarily centered around the articulation of what it means to be a thoughtful and self-governing American citizen. But I think to understand America, one has to have a perspective outside of America. And that means that, you know, let's say the great sources of our own civic tradition and American political thought more largely are part, as I think everyone pointed out, a larger conversation about the good life and the good citizen, you know, going back to Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and manifested in the larger Western tradition. So, you know, Americans feel very comfortable turning to Shakespeare because he's, you know, the Anglo-American poet. But I do think we have to, I mean, let's quote that letter Thomas Jefferson wrote 8 days before he died in 1826, where he didn't claim the Declaration of Independence was an expression of his own mind. He claimed it was an expression of the American mind and of the great books of natural and public right, Aristotle, Cicero, Sidney, and Locke. That's Jefferson, you know, who privately said Epicurus was the highest guide to understanding morality and philosophy. So I think even to be a good American, and to be a thoughtful, self-critical, and self-affirming American citizen, you need to engage in the larger conversation of humankind. Not in that Oakshottian sense where the conversation never ends and you never have an answer. It's just, sort of endless aporia. No, I think I'm not sure that's adequate for liberal education, but certainly not adequate for civic education. But I think civic education can never simply be self-contained. I mean, it could never really exist without liberal education, even though I think Catherine Zuckert made a very important point that liberal education, in the, you might say, the deepest and most thoroughgoing way, really is a vocation for the few. And I don't think those two claims are in opposition. In other words, there's a dependence of civic education on liberal education, but liberal education as that more serious engagement with the Socratic what is questions, that's an enterprise that's probably not available to all people in the fulsome sense of the term.
You just answered it for me.
Oh, dear.
I thought we were in agreement on that.
So the question was, should students be forced to be free?
It was, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think, sure, higher education is not for everyone, right? But I do think that insofar as we are talking about higher education, liberal education has to be at the heart of it, that education is not meaningfully higher except in cost. If we don't have liberal learning right at the heart of it, which means that our general education should be a kind of liberal education. And of course, we're not forcing anyone to be free because we're not forcing anyone to go to university. But I do think it's very important that our universities not just become trade schools, and they're quickly descending into that. But I would also say that my experience in teaching students who don't know what a classical text is, right? They have no idea why they should be reading Homer or Aristotle or Greek tragedy or Thomas Aquinas or whatever. The kind of feedback that I get from them is typically that it was so transformative for them and that they were so glad they were forced to take this class. So, yeah. So my conclusion is, yeah.
Perhaps we should force them.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go to university, expect at least a modicum of a liberal education.
Can I just add, I think the vast majority of our colleagues have very little idea what liberal education is, and that's a big problem. I know one of the ideas that my colleagues at Assumption would rally to occasionally is, let's have a interdisciplinary this or that. And I once participated in an interdisciplinary summer forum on Machiavelli, but we couldn't get beyond Machiavelli from the historian's point of view, Machiavelli from the sociologist's point of view, Machiavelli from the philosopher's point of view. Heidegger, whose authority I don't normally appeal to, had a very good argument about what he called the point of view of the point of view. In other words, just take our disciplinary hats off and read Machiavelli as if he might have something to teach us, or maybe something we need to reject. But adding together the sociological, philosophical, historical, political point of view doesn't really get you anywhere.
Right.
And that thing you're getting in the humanities,
Yeah.
really, it's another manifestation of
exactly.
the humanities not really understanding or being committed to the liberal arts.
Yes, exactly.
Well, we do actually have just a few more minutes, so I'll ask a second question, which is perhaps related, or at least it's related if we assume, with I think at least two of our panelists, that liberal education in its fullest form is not for everyone. But my own question, and I'll admit that this is self-interested, I teach more on insofar as we can put this in a SCETL Venn diagram, I teach more on the liberal arts side than on the civic ed side. And I sometimes worry in teaching, say, Plato's Republic, but this applies as well to Locke, right? A civic education, I think, it can't be value neutral, right? We do need to teach students how their society works, and by that it means to work well, right? So there is actually something to show them that is good, valuable, worthwhile, and maybe even worth sacrificing for about their civic order. Then, so that's sort of at least how I envision some element of civic education. On the other hand, with liberal education, because we're opening it up to ask really what is best. You read Plato's Republic and you don't conclude from that very often, liberal democracy, that's the way to go, right? So should we be in any way nervous in teaching students the liberal arts that they might not be ready for what they are to encounter vis-a-vis civic education, or vis-a-vis anything else, I suppose, but this panel is about this particular tension.
Okay, it depends on how you teach it.
Yeah.
If you teach it from the perspective that Plato's got a mixed reputation actually, but a pretty big one way or the other. Let's see what he says and not put a label on it. And speaking for myself, when I was in college, I really didn't think that the Republic was very attractive. I had grown up in a liberal democracy, and I think that's not unusual. So I wouldn't worry so much about, I understand education to be initially challenging students to look at their own opinions. That's not a comfortable thing to do, and so some people rebel against it. Some people don't like it. Some people avoid those courses. But I think to become a human being, that is important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think to describe human and political phenomena, we have to understand them as they are. And understanding things as they are is understanding the qualities inherent in the phenomena. Leo Strauss has an argument in Natural Right and History in the chapter on Max Weber where he says, a value-free description of a concentration camp would be an evil parody. You know, it would be a Swiftian parody of some sort, right? So Max Weber's a very instructive figure because I think he was an incredibly learned man, a decent man, committed to moral nobility and truth. Moral probity, in a way, drove him to value relativism. And yet, in the end, as Vogelin and Strauss both point out, Weber's work is filled with value judgments. He could not discuss the sociology of art. He could not discuss religion, the Protestant ethic, the various forms of political legitimation without speaking the way Plato and Aristotle did, you know. And yet, Weber, I think, incoherently, there's a kind of undercurrent of Nietzschean nihilism. Only big babies in editorial chairs believe in silly notions like natural right. And in the end, he attributed his own thoroughly, I think, reasonable and decent choices for moderation and the pursuit of wisdom to a demonic choice. I choose, and it may turn out to be, an angel or a demon, a god or a demon. So the idea that the ultimate root of value judgments is a kind of groundless and empty decisionism. And I think, Weber articulates that in a very Germanic way. I said, with accents of Nietzsche. But I think most people teaching in universities today believe in something like decisionism, and yet they incoherently pair that with moral indignation of various sorts. But I don't think that's a mistake either, or I don't think that's unintelligible, because as the late Michael Polanyi had argued, when you do not judge, when you do not adjudicate moral and political phenomena before the tribunal of reason, and especially moral political things, the tribunal of practical reason, moral judgment, moral passion is going to go underground. It's going to come back up again as ideology or moral fanaticism, and you are prohibited from objecting to that moral fanaticism, which is simply identified with unexamined justice or unexamined commitment. So in a way, a lot of people I think don't see this, but value relativism and ideologically grounded fanaticism, I thought I turned my phone off, they're two sides of the same coin, it seems to me. And the recovery of rational inquiry and the place for value judgments with it is also part of a larger recovery of measured judgment.
Yeah, I mean, I would just simply add, because I agree with my co-panelists, is that neutrality comes in degrees, right? And what I would insist is that on a very high level of generality, we are not neutral. And in fact, that we cannot be neutral. And so we might as well not pretend. Like, the university can't be neutral about truth being a good. Otherwise, we should just shut down. Like, what are we doing? And I think, and again, we don't need to be neutral about the value of the text that we're teaching. If we don't believe, if we ourselves as professors do not communicate the value of what we're doing, our students, I mean, they see it, they know it, and they respond. And of course, I think Weber on the fact, I mean, I'm an Aristotelian. I think Weber on the fact value distinction is nonsense anyway. But I do think that there is, within that space, the real work of a liberal education is reading the Republic and and drawing out of students, what their reaction is and why, right? It's always this emphasis on the why. Well, like, you're uncomfortable, but why? Is the argument wrong? If the argument's wrong, with what is wrong with it? I mean, because you're asking them at the end of the day to constantly be reflecting on their own humanity, right? As a project that they necessarily are invested in. And again, what's the point? Because the reality is that they need to have some vision of the good, or they're not free, right? And we just can't lose that in liberal education, that's what we're trying to help our students to do, is be equipped to fashion for themselves meaningful, purposeful, flourishing lives, regardless of their career, regardless of their trade. You are going to be a human.
Thank you all. I think now we have time for a few audience questions, so please come to, I believe this is our only mic. Yes, so if you could come up here, and I believe our rule here at SCETL is please ask a brief question that is brief and also a question. Please.
Thank you. So I'm an undergraduate student here, so I guess I'll just start off by asking my question. For students who treat liberal or civil education as more of a shackle, kind of like you guys talked about earlier, and for the amount of Americans who just simply don't understand, I believe 26% was the number, who don't understand like the purpose or the inner workings of the three different branches of government, what would you say to those type of students to kind of allow, how would you make sure that we can kind of increase those numbers and those statistics? And how would you say that we can kind of, if you don't understand how government works, how can you allow government to be truly representative? So what would you do in the K through 12 or in higher education in order to ensure that? Thank you.
Okay. There's a kind of chicken and egg problem here, because students go to kindergarten and high school before they come to college. And I'm old enough to have heard students, in this case coming to Carleton, who said, oh yeah, I came to college. You know, I studied a Greek tragedy as a senior, and I really would like to study another one. Or I have, I've heard of this guy Faulkner. You know, he's kind of interested. But when I went to my freshman seminar, they told me, oh, no, this is not what it's about. It's about the disciplines.
Yeah.
The German, research university. So first thing, in a way, is that we have to try to teach a cohort of people in college who are interested in teaching younger people that education isn't all about the disciplines and specialization. And there's no easy answer to this. I mean, I have spent my life teaching what are known as great books, and that was a choice, and I love doing it, and I think I'm a fantastically privileged individual. But here I teach teachers from the Great Hearts Academy who teach great books, and they surprisingly say, you know, the students who read them in high school, they think that then they've read them from, that's it, so we don't need to do that. So there are different levels of education. So I think, yes, you need to introduce sympathetically some works from the past that are hard, not just in college, but beforehand. I also think, and I guess I would just fill in my version of what Levin was arguing partly, that people in this country have come to understand what's now called democracy. It's not even called liberal democracy anymore. The way the Athenians understood democracy, i.e. as direct democracy. We all get together, we punch something or we pull things, we vote, and that's what it is, and the majority rules. And that was shown. I mean, Athens didn't last for long because that's a terrible, unstable form of government. So what's a better form of government? Actually, in the United States, the Federalists put a lot of thought into that. However, my experience when I taught American government was the Federalist Papers are really hard for students to read now, either in high school or introductory college. There's a colleague of here who did an edited version of the Federalist Papers, and I think it would be wonderful if that were assigned, not the whole thing, but some pieces and taught. So people in this country would come to understand, as far as I can tell, they do not understand how this government is supposed to work and why it's really reasoned. And it's not just go to vote. It involves institutional design and a lot of complicated things. And it's not also just participation. One of the other opinions I acquired teaching American government is if you want students to lose any interest they ever had in politics, send them to a school board meeting or have them go to the city council. So, you know, teaching takes a lot of imagination and dedication. There's no formula for it, but we have to try to introduce things that have been lost, not just in college, but also earlier.
You know, Oscar Wilde wrote an essay in 1893 called The Soul of Man Under Socialism. And by socialism, he really meant participatory democracy. And his one-line response was, it takes too many evenings. And a lot of the theorists of participatory democracy, really academics, you know, we're going to have a Habermasian communicative rationality situation at a departmental meeting, you know, this sort of endless blather at the service of nothing. So I would say, I think young people, look, we can't get indignant at young people for not understanding the good, or what's good for them, that they really are naturally political animals. Maybe a little gentle teasing doesn't hurt. I remember Ben Stein, the political writer and sometime financial advisor, son of a famous economist. He wrote an article in the American Enterprise talking about his intern at UCLA, who came into his office indignant. She had just read that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and she wanted to do something about it. And he had to, he's the guy who appears in Ferris Bueller as Day Off as the teacher. And he said, I had to calm her down and say, well, we won that war. The Japanese are our friends. They're actually doing much better than we might have predicted in 1945. And, you know, I had a colleague who taught theology, and he would get these students who would say, St. Augustine is boring and everyone is boring. And so he just started reading them a line from St. Thomas Aquinas. Boredom is a reflection of the sin of sloth. Usually you're readily bored if you're lazy. And I would just add one other thing. I think one of the most loathsome things we see, and I haven't seen it at ASU, I have to say, but I did see it when I was a visitor at Princeton a year or two ago, how when you don't have a liberal and civic education, what fills the gap is what I call the tyranny of ideological cliches. You have a lot of ignorant young people speaking in cliches. From the river to the sea. They don't know what the river is. They don't know what the sea is. I think they sort of know what the idea is, but when that kind of activism, not rooted in historical knowledge or civic engagement or philosophical reflection, where you just run around angry, repeating it's not very dignified. It's not very productive. And so maybe young people, if there was a little more self-criticism, and some of you guys said to those guys, we're tired of this. We actually want to talk about things. We want to because it is sort of a laughable pose, you know. But it's and really what's happened is you have these vociferous minorities. I don't mean racial minorities, just voices. They don't really represent the majority of students, but they're allowed to represent the majority of students, but precisely because they're the most aggressive and they have the most cliches. So a liberal education will liberate you from boredom. You won't make the mistake that Ben Stein's intern made, and you might actually find that you can live a life with some leisure in it, where it's not just the bars on Thursday and Friday night, as important as that is in the college experience. But you might actually, when you have some free time, be able to sit down with a book and find illumination. So, one thing I learned a long time ago, we on our side can't get too cranky on this because students won't listen to us. But maybe some way of just saying, look, there's a lot before you if you open yourself up to it. But that's hard, and it's not for everyone. And I'm absolutely convinced that much more damage has been done by the gadgets and the internet than good, especially for your generation. And I don't have any idea how to get around that. But anyway, those are some thoughts.
Thank you.
And I think we have time for one more question, perhaps brief-ish answers as we stand in the way of their lunch.
Got it. Yes, talking a lot about civic education, and obviously there's lots of ways to be civically involved and being a civic leader, but ultimately it comes down to voting. At the 2022 midterm elections, I counted 86 items on my ballot. And a lot of smart people in this room, a lot of well-educated people in this room, I would argue that there's not a single person in this room that could logically think about and make a conclusion on all 86 of those issues. What do you do in terms of civic education to get people encouraged to be involved when the ultimate process of being civically involved is so confounding and overwhelming?
Try to introduce them to the other parts of politics, because it isn't all about voting. And there are many, many ways in which you can participate in sub-political associations that still teach you things that are relevant to the community and ultimately to politics, and are also much more satisfying.
About voting, I mean, there's a whole industry that complains that not enough people vote in the United States. Frankly, I'm not sure I want people to vote who don't know who their candidates are until a couple of weeks before, or haven't reflected on any of the issues. I'm not a big fan of compulsory voting laws like in Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere, Brazil. I do think that there's a danger in identifying citizenship too much with voting. I'll follow Catherine here. Rousseau, who says many wise and unwise things. But,
Like forcing to be free from my.
but in the Contrat Social, he mocks the English. Now, most of us look at the English, this is the home of modern liberty, that's Montesquieu's view, that's the founder's view, and he says, look at those slaves. They're only free when they vote every 2, 4, or 6 years. He said, what kind of citizenship is that? You know, and he had in mind active citizenship, you know, but that's Sparta, and that can fill one with some fear and trembling. But I do think we can be reminded that it's not sort of to use an old-fashioned image, the League of Women's Voters stuff from the 50s and 60s, you know. Be informed about your local issue and referenda. That stuff's not unimportant. But I do think the Tocquevillian art of association, of being involved in the full array of intermediate institutions that sort of mediate everyday life and political life, is a very important way for Americans learning citizenship in a way that's not excessively preoccupied with, like voting every 2, 4, or 6 years. By the way, if you vote every 2, 4, and 6 years, I don't think you're a slave. I think Rousseau goes too far that way.
Oh, only that way?
Well, we could name some others. Yeah.
All right, well, if there's nothing further, please join me in thanking our panelists.